Working as a freelance locksmith often involves opening doors for people who have lost their keys, but occasionally it involves cracking open secrets that were meant to stay buried. David, a 34-year-old lockmaster, was hired by a nervous landlord to open a heavy, impenetrable steel safe left behind by an evicted tenant in a rundown apartment building. It was late in the afternoon. The apartment was completely stripped bare, leaving only the massive black safe sitting in the center of the living room floor. David inspected the digital keypad. Instead of using a loud acetylene torch to cut through the thick metal hinges, which was his usual method for abandoned safes, he decided to hotwire the electronic locking mechanism to save time. It took him 20 minutes of delicate rewiring. Finally, the heavy locking bolts clicked with a loud, satisfying thud. David grabbed the heavy metal handle and swung the door open. He expected to find stolen jewelry, stacks of cash, or perhaps just empty space. Instead, his blood ran cold. Sitting right at the front of the safe, completely unobstructed, was a live, military-grade explosive grenade. David froze, realizing that if he had used his acetylene blowtorch to burn through the metal door, the intense heat would have detonated the explosive, leveling the entire apartment and killing him instantly. But the grenade wasn't the most disturbing thing inside the vault. Behind the explosive were dozens of small black SD cards and a thick, leather-bound journal. When the bomb squad and local authorities arrived to secure the room, they examined the contents of the safe. The SD cards contained thousands of files of horrific, illegal child exploitation material. Curious as to what kind of monster lived in the apartment, an officer opened the leather journal. The writings inside were so depraved, detailing the tenant's sick fantasies and future plans, that the seasoned detectives had to physically look away. David locked the door to the apartment and walked away, haunted by how close he came to being blown apart by a monster's booby trap. Buying abandoned storage units at public auctions is a massive gamble. Buyers often bid entirely blind, hoping to find valuable antiques hidden among the trash. In August of 2012, a buyer named Mark won a bid on a large, unair-conditioned unit in Pensacola, Florida. The Florida summer heat was sweltering, pushing temperatures inside the metal storage rows well over 100 degrees. When Mark used his bolt cutters to snap the lock and roll up the heavy metal door of his new unit, he was immediately hit by a wall of foul, chemical-laced air. It didn't smell like rotting garbage. It smelled sharply of formaldehyde and decay. Mark stepped into the dark unit, shining his flashlight over the contents. There was no furniture. Instead, the floor was covered in everyday household storage items, plastic Tupperware containers, heavy-duty black trash bags, and large styrofoam soda cups. Confused, Mark picked up one of the large styrofoam cups. The plastic lid was cracked, and a thick yellowish fluid was leaking out onto his gloves. He carefully popped the lid off and shined his flashlight inside. Floating in the chemical preservative was a human heart. Mark dropped the cup in horror and stumbled backward out of the unit, immediately calling the police. When a hazardous materials team arrived, they began opening the rest of the Tupperware containers and trash bags. The entire unit was a makeshift morgue. Inside the plastic containers, authorities discovered over 100 human body parts, including 10 intact human brains, lungs, and various tissue samples, all slowly baking in the Florida heat. The investigation quickly traced the rental agreement back to Dr. Michael Birkland, a former medical examiner who had been fired in 2003. Instead of properly disposing of remains from private autopsies he conducted at local funeral homes, Birkland had been secretly harvesting the organs, packing them in everyday kitchen containers, and hoarding them in a public storage facility for nearly a decade. Finding hidden rooms in an older house can be an exciting discovery for a new homeowner, but for a 28-year-old man named Thomas, it quickly turned into a nightmare. Shortly after moving into his newly purchased home, Thomas was inspecting the tight utility closet that housed his water heater. While checking the pipes, he noticed that the drywall behind the heater felt loose. He pushed against it, and a large section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small hidden door. Curiosity getting the better of him, Thomas squeezed past the water heater and opened the door. It led to a cramped, low-ceiling crawl space that was bizarrely lined with thick, clean carpeting. At the very end of the tunnel was a heavy, solid black door secured with a padlock. Determined to know what was in his house, Thomas grabbed a crowbar and violently pried the locking mechanism off the black door. Inside was a tiny, pitch-black room. Sitting perfectly in the center of the floor was a heavy, fireproof sentry safe. The safe wasn't locked. The latch was broken. Thomas slowly pulled the heavy lid open. The safe was completely empty, except for two items. The first was a stack of unlabeled VHS tapes. Someone had taken a thick black marker and written the words, "No, no, no," across the plastic casing of the top tape. The second item lay at the bottom of the safe. It was a single piece of lined notebook paper. Written in thick, dripping black ink were two words, "Save yourself." Thomas didn't play the tapes. The sheer malicious energy of the hidden room was enough to convince him that whatever was on that magnetic film was not meant to be seen. He packed the tapes and the note into a box, drove straight to the local police precinct, and handed them over to a detective. He never found out what the police saw on those tapes, but he immediately put the house back on the market, unable to sleep, knowing what had been hidden behind his walls. Sometimes, the most horrifying discoveries aren't the result of a murder, but of bizarre human eccentricities. In a small rural town, an auction buyer named Shannon Wisnet purchased the contents of a defaulted storage locker for a few $100s. The unit was mostly filled with worthless junk, but sitting in the corner was a large, heavy-duty barbecue smoker. Thinking he could clean it up and sell it for a decent profit, Shannon loaded the rusted metal smoker into the back of his pickup truck and drove it home. Later that afternoon, Shannon opened the heavy metal lid of the smoker to scrape out the old grease and ash. As he reached inside the dark, soot-covered barrel, his hand brushed against something heavy, wrapped tightly in thick layers of aluminum foil. Assuming the previous owner had left a frozen pork shoulder or a brisket behind, Shannon pulled the heavy, foul-smelling package out and set it on the grass. He took out his pocket knife and sliced through the layers of foil. As the foil peeled back, Shannon didn't find a piece of meat. He found a severed, decaying human leg, cut cleanly just below the knee. Shannon panicked, backing away from the gruesome discovery, and immediately dialed 911, convinced he had just uncovered the evidence of a brutal homicide. The police confiscated the limb and launched a massive investigation. However, when they tracked down the original renter of the storage unit, a man named John Wood, the truth turned out to be far stranger than fiction. Years prior, in 2004, John Wood had survived a horrific plane crash, but his injuries were so severe that his lower leg had to be amputated. For bizarre personal reasons, John requested to keep his amputated limb, hoping to one day be buried with it. He wrapped his own severed leg in tin foil, placed it inside his barbecue smoker for safekeeping, locked it in a storage unit, and promptly forgot to pay his monthly rental fee.